Hey guys, I'm Alex, and today we're going to be talking about the skull and the brain. Just a quick overview of this lesson. We're going to mention the bones of the skull, the lobes of the brain, as well as other structures of the brain. We're going to mention the ventricles and cerebral spinal fluid and a clinical case involving those. We're going to talk about blood flow of the brain, and then we're going to have a short quiz, so make sure you're paying attention. Starting off with the bones of the skull, I'm going to break it up here and do bones of the nasal cavity first. There's going to be a common theme throughout this presentation on reflection down the midline of the head. So most of the things we mention will be kind of doubled across the midline unless we state otherwise. So first up, we have the nasal bone, lacrimal bone, inferior nasal concha, the palatine, and the vomer bone, which is unique in this, that it's down the midline. There's only one of them. More on the face, you have the maxilla, two large bones here, the mandible, which breaks that rule of reflection and is only one bone, and zygomatic bones here, which are your cheekbones. Next, we're going to have bones of the cranium. So these bones kind of protect the skull. There's 6 of them. The first 4, the frontal bone, parietal, occipital, and temporal bone, all coincide with a lobe of the brain, which they are close to. Then you have the sphenoid bone and the ethmoid bone, which you can just see poking out here of the eye socket. It protects the front of the brain here. Now I'm going to pass it on to Nate for the anatomy of the brain.
Hey guys, so now we're going to jump into the anatomy of the brain itself. And the first thing when we talk about the brain is we're going to talk about the cerebrum, which is the first large part. The cerebrum of the brain is probably the part you consider that looks like the brain. It's the top part with all these lines and divots in the top, and it's the part of the brain where all of your higher mental functions take place. Like Alex said earlier, the theme of today is reflection down the midline. The cerebrum comes in 2 hemispheres, a left and the right. So each of these 4 lobes that it has a left and a right part, and we'll show that more clearly in a later picture. But the 4 lobes of the brain coincide to those 4 cranial bones that we mentioned earlier. The frontal lobe is in the front of the brain, right where you think it would be. The parietal lobe is sort of on the top back part of your brain, posteriorly and superiorly. The occipital lobe is posterior and inferior, so sort of the back bottom part of your brain. And finally, the temporal lobe is sort of laterally on either side, sort of right underneath where your temple is, if you're familiar with that, sort of near your ear. The cerebrum, like I said, it comes in a left and a right half. You can sort of see that here, sort of how it's reflected on either side, left and right side. And those 2 hemispheres are separated by a fissure or a depression, a space, however you want to consider it, called the longitudinal fissure, which runs right between these 2 cerebrum hemispheres. The internal structure of the cerebrum comes in 2 different layers. The first layer is called the cerebral cortex. It's the outer layer. So on this image here, it's the darker, more pink color. That's the cerebral cortex. That's made up of something called gray matter. And this is the part of the brain where, like I said, a lot of higher level thinking happens. Things like dreams and language and your consciousness and just thought itself all happens here. So a lot of the things that we consider to make us human come from the cerebral cortex. And the inner layer, this white stuff you can see here, it's called white matter. It's basically just a lot of myelinated axons that are sort of connecting all the other portions of the brain and the other portions of the gray matter. Those are the 2 layers of the cerebrum. Looking at some other pieces of the brain that aren't that upper cerebrum part, let's start with the cerebellum. Cerebellum is the posterior and inferior part of your brain, so the back bottom hangs off the back. The cerebellum is really easy to tell because it has this sort of like grainy lined look to it. And it's what takes care of your posture and motor control of your body. Just like the cerebrum, it comes in a left and right hemisphere. This is a slice down the midline of the brain, so we're only looking at one side, but there would be another hemisphere to this cerebellum here. And the cerebellum is bridged by part of the brain called the vermis. Sort of can see it here, but it would also be right around here in the cross section. That bridges the two hemispheres of the cerebellum. The next structure is the diencephalon, which sits sort of in the center of the brain right here. And that houses some parts of the brain you're probably familiar with, thalamus, the hypothalamus. But the only one you really have to worry about is this part that hangs off the bottom of the diencephalon. And that's the pituitary gland. It's an endocrine gland, releases a lot of important hormones for the body. Next, getting into the brainstem, you have the midbrain, which is sort of right in the middle. Midbrain sort of processes sound and sight. Any reflexes that are based off of your senses, those get processed here. Next, below that, inferior to that is the pons, which sort of acts as a bridge, if you will, between the cerebellum and the brainstem and the other parts of the brain, has to pass through here. And then finally, we have the medulla oblongata, which is way at the bottom. You can think of this as sort of your most basic functions: heartbeat, breathing, digestion, the autonomic functions that you need to stay alive that you don't have to think about. Those happen there. And these three together, the midbrain, the pons, and the medulla oblongata, make up the brainstem. So just quickly to take a look at an anatomical picture from a cadaver so you can see what this looks like in real life. This again is a cross section through the midline of the brain, so we're only looking at one hemisphere. Towards the front here, we have the frontal lobe. Parietal lobe again sits on top, and the occipital lobe is posterior. In the back, there would be a temporal lobe on the side. We can't really see it because you have to look laterally to see it, but it's over there. Again, right in the middle, diencephalon. Inferior to that, you have the midbrain, the pons, and then medulla oblongata. There's the brainstem. Posteriorly and inferiorly, there's the cerebellum, one half of the cerebellum. And then finally, hanging off the diencephalon inferiorly is the pituitary gland. Next, let's talk about sort of the protection of your brain. The outermost layers of protection we're not going to talk about. They're kind of self-explanatory, that being your scalp and your skull. That's a bone. We all know what bones do. But below the skull are three different layers of protection called the meninges. The first of those being the dura mater, which is pictured here in blue, sits just beneath your skull. And there are two layers to the dura mater. These are tough layers, protective layers, but there are two with a space in between them. This space is called a sinus, and it becomes very important when we start talking about venous return of deoxygenated blood from your skull. But we'll talk about that later. Just remember that this space does exist between the two layers of the dura mater. Below the dura mater, we have the arachnoid matter, which is this white sort of, it sort of looks like spider web, arachnoid matter, sits below the dura mater. And then below the arachnoid matter is the pia mater, which is adhered directly to your brain, sort of sits right up against your brain. Between the arachnoid matter and the pia mater, there's this space called the subarachnoid space in between here. And this is important because this is where cerebral spinal fluid, which we'll talk about it later, but this is where it sits. This is where it cushions and surrounds the brain, right in this gap. And just take a little more anatomical look here. This is a brain, skull is chopped open, pulled off. The sort of shimmery white stuff you can see on top of the brain, that's the arachnoid matter. The pia matter is not visual, but it would be under there. And then you can just see the two layers of the outer and then inner dura mater and then the gap in between them. Continuing with the meninges, the dura mater has another aspect, which are called dural folds. And dural folds are dura mater that has sort of folded and extends down through the fissures of the brain or those gaps in the brain. And these dural folds separate important sections of the brain. There's three we have to worry about. The first one is the falx cerebri, which is this top U-shaped one here. And the falx cerebri extends down and it divides your cerebral hemispheres. So it fits right into that longitudinal fissure we showed earlier. The second one is this tentorium cerebelli, which sort of sits posteriorly. And that one divides the cerebellum from the cerebrum. And then finally, this little guy, hard to see, but he hangs off of the tentorium cerebelli, is the falx cerebelli. And this divides the two hemispheres of the cerebellum. I find it easy to remember falx cerebelli has a double L and cerebellum has a double L. The last part of the brain we really have to talk about are the ventricles. The ventricles are important for cerebral spinal fluid. Cerebral spinal fluid, just really quickly, is a clear fluid that surrounds your brain and your spinal cord. It is really important for cushioning, protection. It provides some nutrients to your nervous system. Also, it can remove some waste. So it coats the entirety of your brain and your spinal cord, but it is created in these structures called the ventricles. Ventricles are just literal open spaces in your brain that are filled with this fluid. It's where it's created and it circulates. It starts its circulation here. The first ventricle, where the majority of cerebrospinal fluid is made, is this big one. It's in green here, the lateral ventricle. Once it's created in the lateral ventricle, cerebrospinal fluid flows into this middle blue one here called the third ventricle. From there, it travels down the cerebral aqueduct before it reaches the fourth ventricle here at the sort of the top of the brain stem. And from the fourth ventricle, it then exits into that subarachnoid space we mentioned earlier and coats the brain, coats the entire spinal cord, sort of protects your nervous system. And so just really quickly looking at a clinical case that involves the cerebrospinal fluid is a condition called normal pressure hydrocephalus, or NPH. I'm going to say that instead because it's less of a mouthful. And NPH is caused by just excess cerebrospinal fluid is building up in those ventricles of your brain. And that buildup is causing the ventricles to expand way past the size they should be, which is putting a lot of pressure on other parts of your brain. Your skull is a finite area. It can't expand. So when the inside ventricles are way bigger than they're supposed to be, it squeezes the rest of the brain against the skull and can cause a whole lot of problems. You can see it over here in this image. This is a normal brain. You can see the ventricles here in the center, and then this is an NPH brain. You see it, those ventricles are way oversized, creating all kinds of pressure issues on all other kinds of the brain. The causes aren't exactly nailed down. It's been linked to happen after infection or trauma, tumors, complications after surgery, but there's also a whole bunch of cases that just pop up without one of those causes. So they haven't exactly nailed down what causes it. The symptoms can be really wide ranging because it's pressing on every part of your brain. The most common ones are issues walking, having a hard time controlling your bladder, just slow lethargic movements, and mental impairment. And it's this last one that can cause a lot of doctors to misdiagnose NPH as either Parkinson's or dementia or Alzheimer's. They estimate somewhere that almost 5% of Parkinson's, dementia, and Alzheimer's cases are just accidentally misdiagnosed NPH cases. And that's significant because NPH, unlike those other diseases, is completely treatable. We treat it surgically with something called a shunt. Surgically, you sort of just place a shunt, or it's basically just a tube with a valve, into the ventricle of the brain, and then you string it all the way down to the abdomen here. And what this does is that excess fluid will just, instead of building up and pressing on the brain, it'll drain to the abdomen where it can be processed and discharged. And once this procedure is done, many people can return to somewhat normal life after their symptoms pass because that pressure is gone. But early detection is really, really important. Throw it back over to Alex. We'll talk about some blood flow.
All right, on to blood flow in the brain. So to get things started, we need to get blood into the brain. We can do that via two main arteries, the internal carotid artery and the vertebral artery. Now, the internal carotid artery is a branch off the common carotid artery, and vertebral comes from the subclavian artery, both which can be traced back to the aorta. And those two arteries flow into a structure known as the Circle of Willis. And the Circle of Willis is a ring of arteries that ensures blood flow to any part of the brain has multiple routes. This is important in cases where if you have an artery that is blocked, you don't want a certain part of the brain to get no blood at all. So this whole system is interconnected through different arteries. Coming off of the Circle of Willis, you have the anterior, middle, and posterior cerebral arteries. They're named aptly for where they are located. And you have the basilar artery, which is the convergence of the two vertebral arteries into the Circle of Willis. There's many communicating arteries between all these that ensure multiple routes of blood flow. As for venous return, we have what we mentioned before, special dural venous sinuses. So this is that area in between the two layers of the dura mater. They bring deoxygenated blood out of the head back to the heart and lungs. So blood flow through these is fairly straightforward. Let's say we start from the top at the superior sagittal sinus. We'll come all the way down to the confluence of sinuses, down to the transverse sinus, sigmoid sinus, and out of the head via the internal jugular vein. Located more centrally is the cavernous sinus. Via smaller other sinuses, it will drain as well down into the internal jugular vein. and that is blood flow through the brain. Quiz time. I'm just going to read the questions, and I'll give you a few seconds to come up with your answers or pause the video if you need to. So first question, 3 parts here, fill in the blank. So if someone gets punched and breaks their jaw, the correct name for this bone is the blank. The name for the blank bone and blank lobe of the cerebrum are situated most inferiorly and posteriorly. Has the same name for those two. The 3 portions of the brain stem are blank, blank, and blank. Give you a few seconds here. Pause if you need to. All right. Answers are A, the mandible is the jawbone. B, the occipital bone and occipital lobe are situated most inferiorly and posteriorly. And 3 portions of the brainstem are midbrain, pons, and medulla oblongata. Next question. What is the correct order of venous return flow through the sinuses of the skull? I'll take your time to read the answers and pause the video if you need to. The answer is B, superior sagittal sinus to confluence of sinuses, transverse sinus, and sigmoid. Question 3, true or false? If one develops a complete blockage of their basilar artery, no blood flow will be able to reach the posterior cerebral arteries. The answer is false. The circle of Willis has many connections called anastomosis, ensuring multiple routes for blood flow. Question 4. Which of the following are true of cerebral spinal fluid? This is a multiple select question, so there will be multiple correct answers. The answer is A, B, and D. Cerebral spinal fluid protects and cushions the brain and spinal cord, removes waste products from the brain, and is constantly recycled. Last question, which correctly describes the cerebral cortex of the cerebrum? The answer is D. It is the outer layer composed of gray matter and processes higher level functions. That's all we got for you. Thanks so much for watching.